I'm Les O'Leary of the Illinois Labor History Society. When we discuss the labor movement and problems of unions, industrial relations, all these subjects, we seldom appreciate the depth of struggle that went into the creation of this modern labor movement. In 1936, what was called the CIO, that was then known as the Committee on Industrial Organization, later changed its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. This committee was set up under the leadership of John L. Lewis to organize the mass-producing industries, the industrial unions. And one of the keystones of that drive was in the steel industry. All throughout 36, thousands of workers in the basic steel industry flocked to the union banner. So much so that by January of 37, the biggest of the steel companies, that's U.S. Steel, agreed to recognize the union. But the remainder of the industry refused to go along, and their managers decided to try to destroy the union before it could get a start. This forced the hand of the steel workers. Accordingly, a strike was called in May of 1937. One of the classic cases where this crunch came, where the right of the union to free speech and demonstrate was aborted by public officials, occurred in 1937 in what we call the Memorial Day Massacre at Republic Steel in South Chicago. There's a union headquarters out there now, almost at the very site where those people died, memorializing their names and the men and women who were injured there too. This is Local 1033 of the United Steelworkers of America. On May 26th and again on May 28th, the union tried to set up picket lines at the plant gate. The police, however, chased them away, beat them up, and drove them off, allowing only just token picketing. The union's response was to call for a great mass demonstration to establish the right to have the significant picket line, but the Chicago police refused to permit this to happen, and a very bloody massacre occurred. One of the people who was there is Sam Evett, now District Director of District 31 of the United Steelworkers of America. Sam is here and is going to narrate a film that you're about to see. This is the film that was taken by the newsreel cameras that were established, set up at that time, and we're going to present to you an uncut version.
I was there that day because of my duties as an organizer for the Steelworkers Organizing Committee and my relationship as assistant to Nick Fontecchio, the field director, who was the principal speaker at the Sam's Place preliminary to the march across the field by the pickets. What you're now seeing is the Chicago Uniformed Police preparing to meet and confront the strikers who will be marching across the field from Sam's Place, where they are holding a mass meeting. This is evidently the beginnings of the first group of strikers in the long line of strikers marching across the field, beginning to approach where the police have drawn themselves up in a line formation to block their right to picket in front of the 118th and Burley Avenue Millgate entrance to Republic Steel. I'm sure you observed a number of the police paddy wagons drawn up there. The police were evidently anticipating they were going to be hauling a lot of people away from this area. This is the scene showing the strikers having arrived to confront the police and demand their right to peacefully picket in front of the mill gate. They are arguing with Captains Mooney and Captain Kilroy, explaining to him their right to peacefully picket in front of the mill gate. You can see some of the strikers vigorously arguing with the police. This scene takes place momentarily after a lens change showing the police firing their guns, clubbing the pickets, shooting tear gas. There was a tear gas bomb streaming through the air. If you look closely, you can see the police with their guns in their hand, some of them firing into the backs of the pickets as they struggle to run away from the police. 7 of the 10 men who were killed on that day were shot in the back. The other 3 were shot in the side as they sought to evade the police and to run backwards in the direction from which they had come. There's Loopy Marshall, a social worker from Hull House, being prodded by a police billy club. Workers are down on the field, having been shot. There were 30 others that were injured by bullet wounds that day, as well as approximately 60 more who were clubbed and beaten unmercifully. They're now loading them in the paddy wagon, many of them with blood streaming from their heads. Here's a wounded member of the Union who is being thrown into the police wagon. Mrs. Marshall, by the way, stated that there were 16 in the paddy wagon that hauled her to the police station, some of them dying, wounded, piled on top of each other. Some of them were not delivered to the police hospital, Bridewell Hospital, until some 3 hours after the incident took place. There were many people not in police uniform. We have some suspicion as to their reason for being present. This is Al Causey, who was shot and who was allowed to bleed to death. At least one policeman tried to comfort him. A wounded picket being taken away by a group of Union pickets who had their own car and who had driven across the field to help carry off some of the injured back to Sam's place, where a first aid station had been established. This was brought about by an incident that had happened similarly on Friday evening, the 28th of May, where the police had clubbed a number of the pickets. A view of the Millgate entrance at 118th and Burley, showing evidently some police, some scabs, and company personnel in the background. General view of the South Chicago plant of Republic Steel Corporation. And some of our pickets marching in front of the plant gate. A very limited number, as you can see.
Sam, that's such a shocking film. There must have been a real public outcry of it.
There was, but at the same time, this film that you've just seen was suppressed by the police. The public press, that is the newspapers, tended to support the Chicago police. They looked upon it as a demonstration that warranted the bloodshed by the Chicago police. However, we had had some similar incidents on the evening of the 26th and the 28th of May at the Republic Steel plant in South Chicago, where, again, our pickets had been beaten by police billy clubs. And we were anticipating that they might do that same thing today. That's the reason, for example, you saw in there some of the cars with a Red Cross sign on it were there to help carry any injured who may have been beaten. However, none of them really anticipated any serious incident or any shooting as took place. Consequently, the whole thing was a real tragedy. When the police had their grand jury investigation by the coroner's committee, they marked it down as justifiable homicide. The police alleged that our members were under the influence of marijuana, and that because they had marched across the field that day chanting CIO, CIO, that this was an indication that they were under the influence of dope.
This film shows so much police brutality, it's hard to believe that it would occur, but it's there before your eyes.
Yes, I think if you examine the film very carefully as it's being shown, you can see many of the police with drawn guns firing. You can see the strikers running away from the police line, trying to avoid being injured or hit by the police.
Tell me something about the people who were killed. Were they Republic Steel strikers?
Well, it's interesting, Les, to remember that of the 10 that were killed, there was Leo Francisco, a Mexican, Anthony Taglieri, an Italian, Lee Tisdale, a black, Joe Rothman, who was born in Bavaria in Germany, Sam Popovich, I assume, is a Croatian, Alfred Causey, who came from Alabama, Kenneth Reed, a farm boy from Iowa. There were 30 other victims of gunshot wounds, and there were 60 others who were clubbed or beaten.
Well, you mentioned that lady from Hull House.
Yes.
What was her testimony again? That
Mrs. Marshall, Lupe Marshall, testified that when she was thrown into the paddy wagon and to be hauled to the police station, that they were normally you accommodate 8 passengers in the paddy wagon. She counted 16. Many of them were thrown in on the floor between the seats, and they were piled on top of each other, wounded, bleeding. And she testified before the Senate Investigating Committee that one of them, down at the bottom of the pile, who was very visibly in very bad condition, asked for a cigarette. She lit a cigarette and put it in his mouth. It fell out of his mouth. "Thank you, that's all right," he said. And she said his eyes glazed and she could tell that he was dying right then and there.
Well, you said that the film was suppressed. What do you mean by that?
It was suppressed by the police. The Senate Investigating Committee had to subpoena it in order to have it appear before the La Follette Committee, who conducted an investigation of the Memorial Day incident.
Well, then this really must have been prime evidence in that hearing.
It was, and the Senate Committee also indicated very clearly that the long white clubs that were used by the police, the tear gas that was used by the police, evidently had to come from the properties of Republic Steel Corporation.
How did they get to that conclusion?
There was no tear gas issued by the regular police department that day, and anyone can see very clearly that these were not regulation police billy clubs. As a matter of fact, the police had been housed, fed, clothed, and billeted inside the plant gates by the Republic Steel Company, and the police had been there even before the strike had began.
What about the strike itself?
Well, we, for all practical results, lost the strike, and it took us 4 or 5 years before we achieved our first collective bargaining agreement.